Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, photography lessons from America's Canyon Country, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Court Whelan. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Court.
Great, thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to a deep dive into Canyon Country, not just some of the sights and the sounds and expectations, but also the way I've structured this presentation is to kind of go through the three major canyons areas of Bryce, Zion, and Grand Canyon. And with each of those, basically do little photo lessons of whether it's sunrise and sunset or the wildlife you're likely to see there, to see not just tips and tricks for how to photograph the different sights and sounds you're going to experience in these canyons areas, but also very general tips for really any wildlife, nature, and landscape photography. So even if you are not headed there on your next photo adventure, you're sure to take a lot away from this webinar because it's a lot of photography tips in general for, again, nature, wildlife, landscape, and even travel photography. So the first thing you may be wondering, why in the world is this guy's title slide not even a canyon? It's just colors and a sunset. Well, that's sort of my take on explaining and sort of elucidating that it's so much more than canyons. It's so much more than the red rocks. It's so much more than what you expect when you go to the canyons areas of the desert Southwest. It's big landscapes and towering hoodoos of Bryce. It's these incredible amphitheaters. It's the colors. It's the light. It's the huge vistas, amazing hiking trail, great vantage points. It's the great expedition leaders that get you out to these areas for these big panorama views. Also photo leaders, of course. And it's something a bit of what you wouldn't expect as well. Massive waterways and beautiful turquoise blue rivers running through 2,000-foot tall Jurassic sandstone slot canyons. There's a lot of even the more familiar national parks in the desert Southwest than you might realize. And we explore that on our trips, of course, with Natural Habitat. But the other thing I'm going to talk about today, we'll go over this in a second, but we're going to talk about those three major national parks and three major canyon areas, but we're also going to get into a couple other areas just to show you some other camera and photo techniques with places that we actually don't go to as a company, like Arches and Canyonlands and Escalante, etc. So without further ado, let's give you a little bit of background around what's going on in, quote unquote, canyon country. It's sort of a very general term. If you're from the East Coast, you're probably just thinking, oh yeah, the Southwest, that's all canyon country. If you're from the Northwest, you're just thinking the same thing. It's that little blob on the map, but really it's a very specific area, and it's all about what we call the Colorado Plateau. And so this darker shade that looks maybe like a little bit of a coffee stain on a map is actually a very contiguous piece of deep underground rock. And so what's happening is as the mountains and everything lift around, the Rocky Mountains to the east, and even the La Salle Mountains and all sorts of stuff to the west, and of course you got the Sierras and the California and all sorts of different stuff. This rock that this Colorado Plateau is on top of is really kind of immovable. It hasn't shape shifted. It hasn't done much for literally hundreds of millions of years. It's remained in place. So as a result, despite all the mountain building that's happening around this area of the west, north, south, east, and west of this spot, it's remained relatively intact. So all the different layering you get from, again, literally hundreds of millions of years of oceans layering on top and eroding away, and lakes layering on top and eroding away, you get what we call pages of stone in the geology, is that you can quite literally go through to the bottom of some of these canyons and look at what the earth looked like, or at least geologically and minerally what it was composed of, up to 2 billion years old. We can save all that stuff for one of the geology talks I do on this area, of which I have done a few on Daily Dose. You can certainly go back and watch the recordings. But photographically, it means that it's a really dynamic, really beautiful area that has preserved so many years of Earth's history. And again, it's these pages of stone, colors, gorgeous stuff to be seen. So anywho, let's kind of get a little bit deeper so you can sort of have an idea from that past map. Most of these national parks, of which Utah has, I think, the second most number of national parks in the nation, state or area. Any guesses to number one? Well, you can't answer me live, but it's actually Washington, D.C. has more national parks and monuments in the contiguous area. But Utah is number two, the second in the country, and for a very good reason. It has a lot of national parks, a lot of state parks, a lot of national monuments, and it's all because of this Colorado Plateau. So we're actually going to be focusing on this purple circle down on the left. It's, when you think about it, it's actually a pretty small area, but between each park, they're so different and so dynamic that you get a really, really well-rounded trip. You go to some of these other areas and they look different too. A third area that people like to go to is that Four Corners region. They look different too. There's almost an endless number of things you can do in this desert Southwest, which for the most part is kind of encapsulated in sort of the southern Utah, northern Arizona area. Yes, it gets into Southwest Colorado. Yes, it gets into Northwest New Mexico, but generally these are kind of the areas that are looking at. So this talk is going to mostly talk about this purple area, but we are going to get into a little bit of the green area as well, because I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about a couple of these other big national parks. And, you know, more than anything, if you're joining us on one of our canyons trips, it's not too difficult if you wanted to add a few days, rent a car and add a few days in some of these other areas. I know a lot of guests that I've had either do that before or after the trips, and it's really quite doable. So again, kind of zoomed in, again, so much difference between these areas, night and day difference, but they're all pretty short drive away. So it makes it very, very conducive for these adventures, any sort of photography trip, because you're only talking about a couple-hour drive and you're in an entirely different world. So last kind of deep dive in geology on a big overarching spectrum, this is what's known as the Grand Staircase. Now, not to be confused with the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, that's within this, but the Grand Staircase is a big overarching term we use for this cross section of rock. And if you follow my mouse here, I'm just sort of circling on the left-hand side, this top. This is a north to south cross section. So, you know, left would be the northernmost part, right would be the southernmost part. As you notice, the highest rock is over here on the left, and this is represented by Bryce Canyon National Park. As we make our way through this itinerary, we go through Zion National Park, which is actually at the very bottom of this large trench here, this large chasm. And then we end up going through to Grand Canyon National Park, which is on the rim here of this layer of rock. So if you start looking down at these layers, like peeling back these layers, you're on entirely different layers of rocks with even multiple layers in between. Bryce Canyon, we're at about 8,000 feet, which in an area known as the Pink Cliffs. We'll get some photos of why that is and how to capture it in a second. And then deep down here, we're about 4,400 feet, about 4,000 to 5,000 feet elevation in what's known as the White Cliffs. Look at this layer that it's getting into here. And then even though we're still back right around 8,000 feet, the same as we would be in Bryce, what's happened is this big uplift known as the Kaibab uplift. And so although we're back at elevation, we're dipping down into layers of rock that we haven't seen previously, because if you follow this all the way to the left, yeah, this is way below Bryce and Zion. So it's really cool, once again, how much variation, stratification we get on an itinerary like this. And you're getting everything from these beautiful, I told you, pink cliffs of Bryce and Cedar Breaks. You get the massive vistas of Grand Canyon, which is the oldest canyon in the park, the waterways of Zion, that big deep trench. And then some great wildlife too. You wouldn't normally think of this as a big wildlife trip, but there's some really cool iconic critters that we can see and photograph along the way. So all the photo tips to come, but first the gear. Let's talk about what you need for this trip as a photographer. Well, so if you are like me and have a big fancy DSLR or mirrorless camera, you're probably wondering what kind of lenses to bring. If you have a point and shoot camera, you can absolutely get great photos on this trip as well. One of my favorite point and shoot cameras, or a bridge camera, I don't have a photo here, I should have, but it's called the Sony RX10. If you're wondering, hey, I want to get a new camera system, but this is a little bit too advanced for me, that Sony RX10 is a really great solution. Maybe we'll get some questions about it afterwards, and I'm happy to fill you in. But Sony RX10. Anyway, most folks that have considerations and want to know more about camera gear are talking about what kind of lenses. Okay, I want to bring gear, I have choices. What kind of lenses are best? Well, it's better to have and not need than to need and not have. So I bring most everything with me, and my kit is comprised, I have a few other specialty lenses, but this is sort of my main landscape and canyons kit. We're going to start with no order of importance here. Actually, the most important lens here is probably dead in the middle, this 24 to 105. But people often wonder, why in the world are you saying bring a telephoto zoom lens, 100 to 400? Shouldn't that be for like an African safari? Well, yes, but it also is really, really great for big landscapes. We'll talk about how to do that with Grand Canyon as the example later on in the talk. I love telephoto lenses for landscape. I think it really brings a next level out to photography. But then also you get some pretty great wildlife too, and you wouldn't want to leave this at home. Again, probably the most important, or at least the lens that's gonna be on my camera most of the time, my sort of like wide angle zoom telephoto, whatever you want to call it, basically the 24 to 105 class, or if you have a crop frame sensor, more sort of introductory mirrorless or DSLR, an 18 to 55 is gonna be that range. So 24 to 105 for full frame, 18 to 55 crop frame, and then ultra wide angle end of the spectrum. This is not critical, but I think it's a lot of fun. You can get in some really tight knit canyons, and a big ultra wide lens is a lot of enjoyment out there on these canyon trips. So that'll be the 16 to 35 or crop frame 10 to 22. Camera body, I was just putting together this presentation. Normally I have my Canon 5D Mark IV here as my camera body. I recently upgraded to the R5 Canon and love it, absolutely love it. So this is gonna make its way on my presentation now because it is my new camera and it is spectacular. Stabilization, this is oftentimes a big question is, should I bring a monopod or a full tripod or one of these little travel tripods? Do we need camera bean bags? Really, the only thing you need, unfortunately, is the biggest one. Like the full tripod, I'd say yes, absolutely worth your time. With an itinerary like this, you're gonna be using your tripod probably morning and evening at Bryce Canyon for those sunrise, sunset shots. Not critical, but you can get a better shot with one. And then I actually do have one of these GorillaPods, and I do bring mine with me for some of the water shots that we're going to talk about in Zion in the Virgin River. That way I can hike and trek over the stones with a smaller, lighter tripod. And then a monopod, the only thing that they're good for really, well, shouldn't say only, they are good for using as a trekking pole and also as a moderate stabilization base. I tend to use these more on like wildlife safaris when I just need a little bit of stabilization. I don't find that they really have a point on this trip too much. Trekking poles are a much better option. Okay, so let's explore, let's talk about these parks, let's talk about these canyons, and let's talk about specific photo tips throughout each. So overall, Bryce Canyon is all about the light. It is exquisite. You're on the rim of this canyon. Every single point along this 18-mile stretch of canyon is looking east. So the sunrise photography is absolutely amazing. Sunset photography is great too, but we'll talk about that in a second. The thing that I want to talk about here is that the time of day is particularly important, which is why it is quite important to go on a photo safari or a photo adventure, because you want to make sure that you are getting up at the right times of day to avoid kind of this. This is sort of your harsher light. I think I've balanced this out nicely. It's not too harsh or too contrasty, as we call it. Contrasty meaning the dark darks and the light lights. But the Bryce Canyon amphitheaters and these hoodoos do really, it's a struggle at midday. That being said, the hiking is fantastic. We'll talk about photographing in the slot canyons using that top-down strong light in a second. But first, let's talk about sunrise and sunset. So you are about to learn, if you haven't already in previous webinars, Court's patented 3-step sunrise or sunset process. Okay, so here we are, we're looking out east at sunrise in Bryce Canyon National Park. Isn't it beautiful? One of my favorite places on earth. So the first thing you're gonna do is, find a great vantage point, and as you're looking for your shot, start imagining the rule of thirds over it. And I'm sure most folks in the audience have heard of the rule of thirds before, but just as a quick reminder, basically breaking your section or breaking your photo down into 3 sections. You can kind of see here, the top is the sky, the middle is most of the texture, and then the bottom third is just a very different type of texture. It's like the hiking trail. Also notice that 1/3 sky, 2/3 land. Sometimes I will be very deliberate and put a strong feature of the photo at one of the intersecting points, right? Pretty close to the sun. So the idea is that it's way more aesthetic to have your focal point or your subject, the thing that you really want people to look at, a little off center. This one doesn't perfectly apply because I'm not trying to get people to look at the sun. I'm actually trying to get them to look at the whole photo, but nevertheless, that's what the rule of thirds is adding some significance to the thirds, top to bottom or left to right, I should say, and or left to right. You can use as much as you possibly can. And then usually if there is a dominant subject, placing it at one of these 4 intersecting points, just a little bit off center. Okay, so you found your shot, you are looking at composition. Now it's time to focus. So for a shot like this, we're actually now here at sunset. I want to give a little bit of variability here. We're looking out east again because this whole canyon goes east. So we're getting much more of the subtle colors of the canyon at sunset. So normally what you do is when you depress that shutter button, it's going to focus and meter or choose the exposure for you all in one. As you focus on that spot, it's going to choose a focus point. It's gonna say, okay, it's pretty dark over there, so we're gonna lighten the photo. This is your camera talking to you. I'm the voice of your camera. And it's gonna lighten or darken based on how that point is exposed or how the area around that point is exposed. And that's great for a lot of the time. But sometimes you don't wanna focus on this area. This is the way to get the exposure best because you wanna expose for the colors and textures of the clouds. But you don't really want the clouds to be in focus at the expense of your foreground, right? You want this to be in focus. You just want the amount of light based on the colors of the clouds. So what we do, and this is the advanced tactic, but this is what I'm trying to teach you here, is that you can decouple your exposure and your focus. And this is a really, really helpful way when you have something closer to you in the foreground that you want to get in focus, but you want to expose the colorful sunset, meaning you want the whole photo's light and dark to be based on those colors, which you do for sun and sunrise. Sunset and sunrise. So how do you do that? Well, on a lot of cameras, you have this little asterisk. And what you can do is a little center point autofocus. You put that right over the spot in the photo that you want to expose for. So in this case, I'm doing it for this beautiful color of the cloud. I hit that asterisk and that actually locks in exposure for about 15 seconds. Okay, so and cameras do this. On some cameras, this is not an asterisk. It's an AEL button, auto exposure lock. Kind of a Canon, Nikon thing, Sony, Olympus thing. So AEL or asterisk, that locks the exposure. Then you're gonna move your little center point autofocus button down to the area you want to focus, hold that shutter down halfway, recompose, and takes the shot. So what that does, you actually have 2 buttons, one for exposure and one for focus, rather than just using the shutter for everything. And this is an amazing, amazing trick. So once again, you do these 2 steps, you recompose for the rule of thirds or whatever sort of compositional elements you're trying to use, and it's going to get you a great, a better sunrise sunset shot each and every time. A great, great tip here. So, you know, I said midday, kind of that time from, let's say, like 9, 10 a.m. to 2, 3 p.m. We're not sitting in our rooms. We're not just killing time before the light gets lower again. No, we're out there hiking and exploring and we're photographing. The great thing about these 500-foot tall hoodoos is that once you go down in them, you can get some really, really great angular light. And that light actually reflects off the stone walls quite well. And you can get some beautiful, beautiful shots even at dead middle day. So this is more of an observation, not necessarily like a hard and fast tactic or tip or trick, but is to embrace that angular light. Start looking for it at the bottom of these hoodoos, getting, you know, at extreme angles and pushing yourself to the left or the right of these canyons and photographing down these slots really, really helps with that midday photography. If you're out there at other times, or if you're out in other areas at that time at midday, you do stand a chance of really harsh contrasts within these hoodoos. It's quite difficult to control for. So that angled indirect light is just absolutely amazing. It's one of my favorite things about Bryce in those early morning, late evening hours. You can see here the sunset just bouncing off this wall and into these little hoodoos and slot canyons. It's almost illuminating this calcium in the top, kind of like little candles. It's just spectacular. But there are more things going on in Bryce than just the light and the beautiful stone structures, these hoodoos as they call. There's some pretty cool wildlife as well. So, you know, what is my tactic? What's my tip for photographing classic wildlife portraits? Well, it's pretty simple. Let's start with those of you with point and shoots. If you find this little icon in your camera, it's the portraiture icon. Sometimes it's a little lady with a hat, or it's a person that's just sort of perpendicular to the camera. It's usually some sort of person photo or icon. That's going to prioritize your entire camera for a shallow depth of field. Okay, and so that's the whole trick here, is when you're photographing people or animals, any dominant subject where you want the thing to be in dead sharp focus, but the foreground or the background to be in a blur state or out of focus, that's helpful in a couple different ways. One is it helps isolate the subject and it gets your viewer to know what you're trying to photograph. So here with a pronghorn on the left, you can see I used a very small f number, a very shallow depth of field in order to blur that foreground. And I actually kind of like that with a little goldenrod or I'm not exactly sure, maybe mule's tail or mule's ear flowers, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of green, but blurred out so it's not distracting. You as the viewer know exactly what I'm photographing. And then here with the Uinta prairie dog that's found only in this region actually, there's a lot of grass, a lot of bunch grass, a lot of texture. So I wanted to isolate the subject and blur the background. Again, small f number or portraiture mode, and that helps to, again, blur that background to make the subject pop and appear a little bit more dominant in the scene. The other thing it allows you to do by having that shallow depth of field is that sort of juxtaposition of blur and sharpness makes the thing that is sharp that you are focusing on appear even sharper, right? So both these critters, because there's blur, these look a little bit more tack sharp. You can see a little bit more definition because the eye is looking at intensely non-sharp, and then nice and sharp appears tack sharp. So it's a really, really good strategy. Again, point and shoots, you can very easily just find the portraiture button. For those with fancier cameras that are comfy shooting on aperture mode or manual mode or anything like that, try to dial that f number down to the smallest f number, which is like usually f4, f4.5, sometimes all the way down to f2.8, f3, and then shoot that way. And that intentionally blurs anything before or behind the subject. Okay, so a little bit of planning here, what to do in Bryce. 2 nights is kind of ideal. That allows for 2 half days and 1 full day. I think that's a nice ample amount of time to explore the area. Also gives you 2 sunrises and 2 sunsets, which means 2 dawns, 2 dusks, and that gives you an amazing, amazing time to be there in Bryce Canyon and get a really, really good lay of the land. Season, really anytime May through November. We'll talk a little bit more about seasonality of this entire canyons region in the next area, because I want to move on to Zion next. But basically anytime May through November is a pretty prime area. The reason for that, you can technically go to Bryce in winter, but with that elevation, it can actually be a little bit snowy if you go at other times of year, but we'll talk about that more in a second. Okay, so now we are off to Zion. Zion, by the way the crow flies, actually pretty darn close. You can see here, Zion National Park is just this little blob here. So coming down from Bryce, we sort of go through this way and then enter the main area of Zion National Park. Again, very, very close, only a couple hour drive. What we're doing geologically is coming down from this cliff area, the pink cliffs. We're actually going through the chocolate cliffs and the gray cliffs. It's the chocolate cliffs. It's not like going down Gumdrop Lane or anything. It's just a different color of stone. Going through the gray cliffs and then eventually to the white cliffs. I'm sorry, the chocolate cliffs are actually down here. I was getting ahead of myself. But you can see here, we're going through the gray cliffs to the white cliffs of Zion National Park down in this deep chasm where the landscape changes dramatically. So going from the edge or rim of a canyon down to the bottom of a canyon, everything's different. And Zion itself is just such a special part of the world. So our hiking trails can sometimes look like this. And this looks a little bit gnarlier than it actually is. There are proper trails and you're meandering about through all these different layers and stratifications of stone. And this is all just intense sandstone, very, very hard sandstone. In fact, some of the hardest sandstone in the world, very good for climbing in certain part of the parks. But what we're really looking for is these big towering walls. These actually used to be very large sand dunes back in the time of the dinosaurs. So like 160, 200 million years ago, these were sand dunes that have become lithified, petrified sand dunes, believe it or not. So you have just these incredible slopes and reliefs and valleys and this cross-bedding formation, these lenses of stone. And so it's kind of the land of leading lines. And so we're going to use this as another compositional tool. We talked about rule of thirds. We'll incorporate that in this. But I want to talk about leading lines here as the second really big compositional tool you can use for anything in the world, not just canyons. So with lines, whether they're made by man or by nature, they're really, really good ways to compose your photo to help the viewer's eye go where you want it to go. So here I'm photographing this grand arch on the eastern part of Zion, and it's a very, very big structure. It would probably fit like 200 people in this if we were all standing up there. But in this photo, it doesn't look particularly prominent. It's not popping off the scene in the stage here. So I'm using this cross-bedding formation, these little ripples in the sandstone, to actually direct your eyes up towards it. Because otherwise you might just gloss over it as, oh yeah, just one other little feature in the landscape. So what we're doing here is we're actually using these lines, composing the photo in a way that they are funneled in to that thing that I'm going to show you. And if this doesn't make sense from this photo, you'll see a couple other examples. But with that, you can't just go on leading lines alone. You still want to use the rule of thirds, that traditional way of separating your photo in some sort of significance in these rules of thirds, left to right or top to bottom. You can see here the main kind of arch and that layer of rock on the top, and sort of that near ground, close ground on the bottom 2/3. This arch kind of close to that intersecting point, doesn't fit perfectly, doesn't always have to. But again, using these lines to direct the eye towards the thing you're trying to show off. Now, a little bit more complicated example here, but I think perhaps with a couple of these things, you'll really get the hang of it, is we're down in the Narrows, the hike of the Narrows, which is the Virgin River that cuts through those white cliffs. It cuts through that Jurassic sandstone I keep on talking about. And we actually build upon a few different layers of leading lines as well. So the first is anytime you see a river, that is really kind of your own leading line to show something. And in this case, I'm trying to scoop the eyes of the viewer into the distance. We want to show the expanse, the size, the grandeur of this massive slot canyon, one of the largest, if you could even call it a slot canyon, one of the largest in the world. It measures almost 3,000 feet tall, so it's absolutely massive. So I want to show that size. So by framing it with that sandbank going from left to right, and then the wall on the left, it kind of funnels your view into that distance, into that goal, and you can kind of follow the river as it meanders. But further, using the walls of the slot canyon, it's directing your eyes down into the middle of the frame, and gradually as your eyes make there, you start noticing that that back wall just completely goes up towards the light. So you can see how there's a lot of kind of artistry and composition that is very, very subtle, but very, very intent. I'm intending to get your eyes to look downstream and look up at that beautiful golden wall into the light as if you are walking down this canyon. It kind of puts the viewer there. And then again, just like before, you still want to use the rule of thirds if you can. Near ground, mostly water. Mid ground, a lot of the texture, a lot going on here. And then a little bit more in the distance as well. Okay, so third example here of leading lines, we're going to talk about, this is still the Virgin River in Zion. We have the Watchman Tower in the background. And this is an iconic shot in the dead middle of Zion National Park. And it's a great way to show how a simple river can give you those leading lines. So I'm trying to feature this beautiful tower in the background, this huge sandstone formation, and just that simple curvature of the river, just kind of direct your eyes in the distance towards that Watchman Tower. As you overlay the rule of thirds, you can see here, I'm putting that formation right around the intersecting point of these two lines. And so that offsets it and makes it more aesthetic. We like this photo. We like the composition rules of thirds and leading lines. Okay, so Zion is oftentimes termed the place of water. For a dry, somewhat inhospitable desert, it's a beautiful watery area with the Virgin River. And I love photographing moving water, just like this photographer here. And I will get in the water with the proper gear that Nat Hab would provide you with. And I put my tripod right in and it's just fine, it's fresh water. And what I'm trying to do is photograph that moving water effect. Now, I'll be the first to mention that this is not a great photo. I don't personally like the photo a lot. It's just the best example I have of what I'm trying to illustrate here. Oddly enough, I haven't taken a whole lot of photos down in the Zion Canyon because I'm usually guiding this area and just making sure everybody else is getting good photos. But a couple of reasons why I'm not super thrilled with this photo is you can tell that these rocks are a little bit blurred and I don't like these highlights here. But anyway, a bit of a perfectionist. I just want to let you know that that this is still a good example of what I'm about to show you. So the key thing is when you're in moving water areas, you have to have a tripod. So this is a really key reason why I say bring a tripod. You can bring a smaller travel one with you, but definitely bring some sort of tripod because you want to actually have a very, very stable position to put the camera on, because we're probably talking about something, a 1/10 of a second, something like that. So once we find the area, the trick here, and I'm going to use this lesson as an example, is you want to get even lighting, and it can be quite difficult in these slot canyons as light peeks through the top, but I could have probably turned myself a little bit and gotten even lighting where I don't have that intense bright area. The rest of the scene is in the shadows. So the trick in basically the steps here is once you have your camera on a tripod in the water and you see a nice little composition, you see the moving water, you want to showcase it, is get your camera on shutter speed priority mode, and even smaller point and shoots can do this. So in theory, everybody in the audience has these capabilities, and nowadays even smartphones can do this, but you want to be able to control the shutter speed. That's the most important thing. And you want to be at around 1/10 of a second. It's usually on your camera as 1/10. That is going to be the starting point. And then what you do from there is you want to, on the tripod is you might even need to move the tripod off of 3 legs and pivot it around, because you want to focus on the foreground. And what that means is you want to focus on the thing closest to you. And to me, it's this rock and these rocks, which, like I said, are not in perfect focus in this photo. But for your photo, it will be, because you're taking lessons here. So you want to focus on that. And then you want to lock focus. And the step for doing that is you hold the shutter halfway down with autofocus, it locks it, and then on the barrel of your lens, or sometimes on your camera, you slide your autofocus from auto to manual. And the brilliance there is it locks that focus into place, so you can take a million photos and not have to refocus, recompose, get everything all set. So you do it once and you have that right distance, and that's really, really quite important. And then the last thing you're gonna do is once you take a few shots, a few test shots, is you almost definitely will need to speed up or slow down your shutter. The shutter speed is entirely a reaction to the speed of the water. If I'm photographing the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, a very, very different speed. I might be shooting at 1/40 or 1/50. If I'm shooting a small stream in a little park around me that's barely moving, I might be shooting at 1 full second. If I see a lot of white water coming through and I want to blur that, it might be a different thing. So part of the learning process here is experimenting with it. This is a great place to do so, but starting at 1/10, maybe going up or down to 1/20th, 1/15th, all the way to maybe 1/2 a second, 1 full second, and you'll start to see the effects in your photo. And it's a really, really great technique to do in Zion National Park. And you don't have to be down in the river and in the slot canyon. You can shoot from shore. You can shoot from that vantage point that I showed you with the leading lines of the river. It's just being immersed in the water creates a much more exaggerated effect that I like. Okay, so bighorn sheep of Zion. This is a really, really great lesson for all wildlife photography around the world. I talked about portraiture with my Bryce Canyon prairie dog and pronghorn when you have a lot of background in the shot. So this is more of an edge-to-edge composition shot, as I call it, where the animal takes up the majority of the frame. So what I'm doing here is, you would think, yes, you still want to use those same portraiture techniques where the background should be blurred, and you see that it is. However, here's the crazy thing when you're doing edge-to-edge composition, is that even though you still want the background blurred, if you shoot at those really, really small f numbers like f2.8, f3.5, f4, sometimes depending on your lens, even 5.6, what you might find is as you focus on the eyes, at those small f numbers, those shallower depth of fields, all of a sudden the horns are no longer in focus, the nose isn't in focus. And that's bad. The forehead's not in focus. The eyes are tack sharp, but the ear's not in focus. And so contrary to what you might think, even though this is still a classic portraiture kind of shot, you actually want to use a bigger F number. And what I'm thinking of is using like F8. F8 is a great kind of middle of the road, bigger depth of field. Depending on the context, you might even shoot at F9, F10, F11, because you're widening that slice of focus. So when you focus on the eyes, as you always should, remember that's the golden rule of wildlife photography, always focus on the eyes. When you're filling the frame with an animal, even just the animal's head in this case, or close to just the animal's head, you want a bigger F number. So with those of you with control over your aperture, big F number, F8, maybe even F11. With those of you with point and shoot cameras that aren't yet comfy dialing in your own aperture, you can get a little hack on this, and instead of being on portrait mode, you can go to landscape mode. And landscape mode does just that. It reconfigures all your camera settings and prioritizes for a big depth of field. And that's how we get these big wildlife edge-to-edge composition shots if you do get fortunate and get closer to one of these magnificent bighorn sheep of Zion, a subspecies called desert bighorn sheep. Okay, so photo trip planning, what are we going to do in Zion? 2 to 3 days is ideal. That's what we do in our itineraries. And the interesting thing about Zion is, in contrast to Bryce, that early morning and kind of like late afternoon, late dusk time period is actually not necessarily the best time to photograph. Actually, mid-morning to late afternoon is the best time in Zion because you are down in the canyon. So you actually sunrise wouldn't get you much because the sun's still gonna be behind the canyon for an hour or so, a couple hours. So you actually do want the sun to rise, and midday can be really, really quite good when you are in these slot canyons, when you are in this area of Zion National Park. And again, the season very similar to Bryce and Grand Canyon. It's a little bit wider just because Zion's lower, but our season at NatHab is the best season. So March through November, a little bit longer on the front end if you do make it there on your own. But it is a warmer spot. Okay, and then the last big section we're going to have of this presentation before we go into some of the smaller examples of places like Arches and Canyonlands is good, the grandest of canyons, the Grand Canyon. Great area for black and white photography. One of my tricks, if I am forced to photograph at really harsh midday conditions, when I have a lot of lights and a lot of darks, that really harsh top-down shadowy look to the sun is converted to black and white. You're gonna have those harsh contrasts, so why not celebrate it? Why not emphasize it? So one of the things I do when I'm forced in those conditions is just turn it to black and white. And I do this on the computer afterwards by just desaturating everything. So as we make our way, we're just down here in the bottom of Zion Canyon, and we're coming along here. We're going through the Vermilion Cliffs, which are kind of like a beautiful rusty red. And then there's the Chocolate Cliffs. That's when we circle Gumdrop Lane and Candy Can Alley through the Chocolate Cliffs. Kidding, there's no Gumdrop Lane, but there is a Chocolate Cliff, a real brown, heavy iron concentration. And then to the rim of Grand Canyon. And we do itineraries on both the north and the south rim, which is really, really quite amazing. But what this achieves here is we are now looking down into a dozen plus layers of the oldest rocks you're ever likely to look at on Earth. Whereas Bryce Canyon National Park, you're standing on top of rocks in the realm of 35 to 80 million years, probably more like 50 million years. The very top rocks here that you're standing on are 260 million years old, meaning they were formed before the dinosaurs were ever on Earth. As you're looking down in this canyon, you're probably approaching 1 billion years, and in certain areas, you can see 2 billion years worth of rock right before you. So needless to say, it's big, it's impressive, it's kind of staggering. It's almost too much to take in, almost too much to take in. So how do we photograph it? Well, this is kind of what you're gonna look at. I personally don't find this to be a super interesting photo. It's nice, it documents it. It's got the rule of thirds, upper thirds of the sky, and it's great, and it showcases it. You should take this photo, but this is where I use my telephoto, and I really like to get some telephoto zoom on because I want to start showcasing the features. I want to make something more interesting than just a big old wide shot of the biggest canyon in America. So I'm using my telephoto zoom, and when I go back to this photo, I'm starting to pick out little areas of the landscape that are evenly lit. Like if you see where my mouse is, this area, although it's very, very bright, it doesn't have a lot of shadows. This whole area right here on the right side is all shadows. It doesn't matter if it's all bright or all shadows. What you're trying to avoid is the mixture of bright and shadow. So right here, if I'm circling this area, on the far left side, that's what you're trying to sidestep. So I'm zooming in on areas I find particularly interesting. I found that this Bright Angel Spur Canyon just happened to be really, really great with this red rock, kind of green mossiness to it, and this really just splitting canyon going left to right. When there are shadows, the best way to manage those shadows is early morning, late evening light. When you get that golden, beautiful color, that low angle light makes shadows less harsh and it actually makes the light more interesting. So again, zooming in on just very, very specific features, you might laugh at me and say, why would you ever need 400, 500, 600 millimeters on a canyon strip? Well, because this was a couple miles away, it just makes a really, really nice, beautiful composition with that lighting. The other thing I'm trying to do to pep my photos up in the Grand Canyon, because again, it's almost too much to comprehend, is I'm using framing. I'm using a lot of foreground elements to picture frame my shot. Now, it might not be a perfect rectangle or a perfect square, but you can see here, looking through these rocks, I'm just kind of putting the sense of the explorer, the trail hiker in you, the viewer. They're like, oh wow, look at that view through that little mahogany, that view right there with that a tree on the left-hand side and the rock right there. Oh, very, very interesting. I'm also trying to look for people in the environment. And even though sometimes people may be upset about people photobombing or saying, oh, there's too many people here, I say, you know what? Bring it on. Like let's get them over there. Let's get the two of you posing, sit down, look that way. In this case, it was pretty natural. Fortunately, a couple great travelers of mine. But people in my photos, especially of big landscapes, I absolutely love. And do not hesitate, to incorporate some of those rules of leading lines that we talk about with natural features with human features as well. So check this one out. So in this case, we use the framing, just this little bit of fringe. This little bit of fringe of this evergreen here, it kind of gets you to stop looking there and points in the direction of the woman. And you start to look at her and you notice, what is she looking at? She's looking down that Bright Angel Canyon. And you can see here, again, there's a lot of interpretation to it. You can create your own story with every single photo. The key thing is that you are able to explain it and you're able to justify it. So the leading lines here using this woman is that these branches point down towards her and she is looking out towards the incredible valley and the huge chasm there, and it just creates a beautiful composition that is quite intriguing as well. And also provides a little bit of context, like, oh gosh, that's a person there, and look at that beautiful scenery, my goodness. Okay, so sometimes I simplify even my sunsets. I use telephoto on sunsets as well. So just a reminder from the previous lesson we were talking about, this is a great time where I want to focus on these branches, but I want the lighting and the metering to be on the sunset in the distance. If I were to, once again, recouple my exposure and focus, meaning when I hold that shutter down, it focuses and meters all at once, it's gonna meter for these very, very dark branches. And guess what happens? The whole scene is blown out. It gets very, very bright. What I wanna do instead is I actually wanna silhouette these branches. So I use that little asterisk button, remember we were talking before, to expose for the beautiful colors out here in the distance. And then I have my 15 seconds to recompose the shot and then focus on that foreground. If these branches were all blurred, it would not look as good of a photo. You always want to focus on the foreground. I will say that's a rule I use about 98% of the time. Okay, so wildlife at North Rim. Well, this is a great example of when to use what we call spot metering for birds and smaller critters. So two of my favorite, the California condor, which can be seen frequently around Grand Canyon as they make a rebound, and the kaibab squirrel, part of the Abert's squirrel family, or squirrel group, I should say, with these tufted ears and beautiful white tail. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll put my metering scheme, instead of across the board, across the whole frame, if you go into your camera's manual or menu and set on spot metering, in challenging lighting conditions, especially shooting up into the sky, it allows you to meter just on the subject itself, not taking into account any of the light and dark around it. And that's a really, really great technique when you are dealing with smaller things that might be in bushes or shrubs or up on treetops as well. Give that a try next time you're photographing wildlife. Just don't forget to put it back on the entire frame metering before you continue. So again, 2 nights ideal, best times of day, gives you 2 sunrises, 2 sunsets. Season, anytime May through November is a fantastic time of year to go. And I promised we would talk a little bit about weather and seasonality in general. So as it pertains to canyons areas, you have some altitude to contend with. You also have some low altitude to contend with in Zion. So the trick here is finding that balance, and that's why we keep on saying May through November is pretty ideal. If you go in May, you're probably gonna find that Bryce and Grand Canyon are a little bit on the cooler side, maybe around anywhere from 35 to 40 degrees in the morning, but it warms up to 65, maybe even 70 during the day. So really, really, really great. If you go during, sort of the latter months or even the middle part of the season, you might find that Bryce and Grand Canyon start, at much more reasonable temperatures, like around 55 or 60, and gets into the 70s and 80s during the day, kind of ideal weather. But Zion is the one to contend with. So smack dab in the middle of the itinerary, Zion can get quite hot. So if you go in that early season, Zion usually starts the day around 60 degrees and warms up to about 80, and it's just absolutely beautiful. But if you go during the peak of the heat of the summer, you might be looking at daytime temperatures approaching into the 90s, even the low hundreds. So again, there's no perfect time. It's just more about what you're comfortable with. Feature-wise, photography-wise, all great times of year. So a couple of things I wanted to highlight as well. You can see here, one of the areas we like to stop at between a couple of these national parks is a little state park called Coral Pink Sand Dunes. You can see how I just use these human footprints as leading lines. People might walk up on this scenario and say, oh, this perfect pattern I wanted to photograph got completely ruined by this person that was here an hour ago that walked across. I say, you know what? It's way better. It's actually way better with these footprints because it puts the viewer here. Doesn't it make you feel the sand as you crunch through it? So I do use human elements in my leading lines quite often. I think it makes lemonade out of a situation like this. Okay, the last couple of lessons before we take questions and answers. If you haven't yet submitted a question and you do have one, please use this time to do so. Is we're moving over to another area of Utah that is really quite popular for ecotourism and hiking and photography. We're going to start off with Capitol Reef National Park. And this is a case where, once again, using that human element can be an amazing aspect of the scene. In addition, this is my time to tell you that, believe it or not, there are fall colors as well in the desert. You can see here some of these cottonwoods turning yellow in the September-October period, which is another interesting element that you might want to think about in your own trip planning. The other thing I want to talk about in Capitol Reef National Park is using the blue hour. And the blue hour is that time just after sunset, lasts for about 20-30 minutes at most, when the sky just gets increasingly more dark blue. And this, again, is after the sun has set. So it's another great time of day to be out there. And the idea really is not so much of a technique other than a simple long exposure, but it's really to make sure that you are in position. And when that sun sets, if you feel like taking more photos, anticipate that sort of early night photography where you do get a little bit of remaining light on your foreground. So this is not an artificially lit cliff. This is still just a little bit of that last light coming up. The sun's now below the horizon, but the light is still in the sky. And so with a 2-3 second exposure, I'm able to get that beautiful midnight blue sky with that kind of well lit foreground. And it's a really cool tactic to use in canyon country. Canyonlands is another absolutely magical place. I absolutely love it. Here's a great example of when I'm using a very deep depth of field. This is almost incomprehensible how deep this depth of field has to be, because I'm wanting two things in focus that are like a mile from each other. I need the foreground in focus because that's the thing that's closest to me, but I'm also trying to get the La Salle mountain range and also these distant spires in focus as well. So I'm using a very big depth of field, something like f11, f16, even f22 to make sure everything's in focus. But at the end of the day, if you're faced with this choice and you say, well, should I focus on the background or the foreground? 99 times out of 100, you're gonna wanna focus on the foreground. If this is even slightly blurred, it's usually gonna blow the photo. So hard and fast rule there. Another example, Dead Horse Point State Park, not exactly my favorite name of a state park, but is a really cool like mini Grand Canyon that I absolutely love, is getting people in the photos. I have my wife down there, just posed her looking out across that way, look in the distance, use those leading lines, look along the edge of the cliff. And this is also a technique that I use known as exaggerated composition. And so this does not necessarily fit the rule of thirds. She is not at that bottom right-hand intersecting point. She's actually far further into the corner. And I like to use that technique. It's one of the few times I break the rule of thirds, is when I see a really big scene and I want to put something that's sort of familiar, whether it's a house, a structure, an animal, or a person, and I want to put it way deep in the corner just to show how big that environment really is. Arches, this is a great example of what I call shoot to crop. And when I say shoot to crop, that means when you start with a photo like this is the original photo that I saw, again, beautiful morning light, is I'm saying, you know what, this is cool, but there's a lot of harsh contrast, there's a lot of shadows, and it's not, the most interesting part is really just this contrast between the blue and golden arch. So I'm shooting this photo and I don't have a panoramic camera, but I know that when I go on the computer and crop it, I'm just gonna do this really intense thin crop and get out all that other mess just to create a final photo that's like this. So shooting to crop is my idea of envisioning something and remembering to do it and post-processing it. And Arches is a great example of that. Another time that arches come in handy is when you want to create that sunburst effect. And this is a really, really great technique. In fact, I'm getting a little bit of a sunburst effect here with a little bit of a jailbird kind of striations on my shirt as the sun comes through the window. But to capture it in this burst effect is a really fun technique that I use when I have a very hard opaque structure. It could be a house, it could be a bridge, it could be an arch. So the technique here is you get it on aperture mode, you go to the biggest F number you can muster, which is usually around F22. And then here's where you want to be careful because you don't want to look at the sun directly, obviously. This is actually one of the nice things about the digital viewfinders that we have in mirrorless cameras is as you look at the viewfinder, you're not actually looking optically at the sun. But in the digital viewfinder, still be careful because it's quite bright and it's a little bit jarring to the eye, is you want to move where that sun is about half blocked, meaning it's half open to the eye and half blocked behind the structure. And then you'll notice even in the camera, it starts to create that sunburst. It's all about that pinpoint aperture at f/22, and then that half blocked feature makes it just really, really nice and visible. Okay, so the last place I want to talk about is just a few examples of white balance in Canyon Country. I think this is actually one of the most important lessons. So if you're still with me here, stick along because you do want to hear about white balance. And these photos are from the Dead Middle Escalante here, which is a really, really special place. Not many people get to visit it, but it is absolutely worth it if you ever get a chance. And we're talking about, you know, the colors of Red Rock Country that are here in Escalante, but really all around this area are vibrant, and they span the gamut between, you know, yellow and purple and red and orange, and these are all just variations of iron concentration. Iron's a beautiful thing when it's embedded into a lot of rocks, and so we often have scenes like this where you get these intense yellows and reds and oranges and midnight purples and blues and this cool blue color. And although these are absolutely natural colors and they have everything to do with the angle of the light and the amount of sun coming through, part of it has to do with what's known as white balance. And you hear me hamper on this a lot because it's so important, especially when these are your color schemes. It changes quite a bit. In most cameras, go through these 8 or so different settings. Most people are shooting on auto, and it gives you a little bit of a cooler look. I oscillate between auto, daylight, and cloudy. Let me show you a visual example here. White balance is your camera's way of perceiving and interpreting what pure white is. And the reason this is important is that what white is underneath a golden sun versus a midnight moon versus a fluorescent bulb versus a flash is quite different. Like that white tablecloth looks different when you have birthday candles lighting it up versus overhead lighting. And so your camera, and cameras have long been doing this, is they're adjusting to try to get you accurate colors. So as a result, they have this spectrum of really, really yellow, almost orange, all the way to this cool blue color. And the terminology we use is cool blue to really warm yellow. So cool to warm. In Canyon Country, I usually shoot on warm, meaning that I set my camera on a cloudy white balance. So the spectrum here, don't worry about this bottom row. This is more for like flash and indoor photography, like portrait studios. But daylight is going to inject a lot of blue. Cloudy is going to inject a lot of yellow. Okay, auto is somewhere in between. So the reason this is important is you might see a photo like this, which is absolutely accurate and it's beautiful. It's in a lovely little canyon. And this is a warm photo. This is pretty warm yellow. It brings out the reds and the oranges. Now this same photo, and I guarantee you when I change the white balance here, you're gonna say, oh my goodness, it just became so fake. The reason is because I showed you this one first. So just kind of reset your mind here. So this is the same photo. This is on a cloudy white balance. The next one is gonna be on a sunny white balance. Watch how the blues and purples come out. This is the same photo. This is the same photo. Which one is more accurate? I'll leave that to you to decide. The best photos, of course, are when you get the brilliant colors that sort of mix them all throughout. And this is when that really, really even exposure in photography comes through. So you can see how spectacular these slot canyons and all these canyons are in the desert Southwest. You take a photo like this, you smack the rule of thirds on it, you kind of bring everything together. When you have your light, you have your interesting textures, you have those leading lines, you have a beautiful scene before you. And this is why I love Canyon Country so much. So quick couple of plugs, actually just one plug here. If you are new to NatHab or interested in learning more about nature photography, we have our own blog that I write weekly called The Natural Photographer. That's the website right there. And you'll see that it has all sorts of camera tips from what I bring in my camera bag all the way to everything I was talking about in this presentation and much, much, much more for all of our adventures around the world. And yeah, just one plug today. And with that, I will thank you so much and take whatever questions you have. And as we're ramping up for questions, I'm going to close these blinds. So feel free to sling them at me, Rob.
All right, thank you very much. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these questions. So does the lens dictate the range of f numbers?
Yes, yeah, so your telephoto lenses usually go to like f35 and your wide angles only go to f22, and that's on the most close, like the biggest range. And then the smallest f number, which is the shallowest depth of field, that is where the money comes in. That's where the quality lens is. To get down to f2.8, you're starting to get into really professional gear. Depending on your application, it's worth it, in my opinion. Well, it really just depends, but yes, that's professional, and your intro lenses will usually get down to like f3.5,
f4. Is the 5D Mark IV lens compatible with your new R5?
Yeah, it is. It is. Canon sells an adapter with what's called the EF lenses to the RF lenses. EF is the DSLR, RF is the mirrorless. And yeah, I gotta say, for anybody out there looking to switch, the adapter is great. Like no issues whatsoever. Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's really great to be able to transition over.
So let's say I use a Sony RX10. Can a GorillaPod be better than no tripod for sunrise and sunset?
You know, I mean, a tripod, because of the stability and the ability to go from this big all the way to like 3-4 feet tall, is always going to give you more. It's always going to be more versatile. It's going to be more flexible. It's just going to give you more options. So for sunrise and sunset photography, when I'm at a viewpoint, I really, really prefer a full-size tripod. The GorillaPod is great when you know you're going to be on a longer hike and you just don't know if you're going to need a tripod, but might throw it in. Like you don't want to bring a big, heavy 4, 5, 6 pound tripod if you don't know you're going to need it. When I know I'm going to use a tripod, I bring my full proper tripod.
Got it. Thanks for covering that. So could you re-explain focus on foreground, lock focus, and then recompose?
Yeah. So basically here, I'll get my camera right here. So, okay, so what I'm talking about there is I'm shooting whatever, a canyon, and I'm always on autofocus. Like it's just easier, it's better, it's faster, it's more accurate. So I have my center point, only the dead middle of my frame is what's focusing. And sometimes you have to go in your camera and set that. I don't want the camera to decide where in the photo to focus. Meaning if I focus twice, it might focus here this time and then here this time. I always turn it off that and set it in the autofocus settings for dead middle. And you'll have to probably look in your camera's manual for that because every camera is a little bit different. But with that center point autofocus, that way I always know that the dead middle of my frame is what I'm focusing on. So I focus on that rock over there. I hold the shutter halfway down, it autofocuses, makes the noise, it autofocuses. And then what I do is on this side of my barrel, I switch from automatic to manual. And so when I autofocus and I switch and I don't touch this focusing ring anymore, it stays there for each and every shot. Whereas if you were to keep it on auto, lock it on that rock, and then recompose for the photo, because you don't want the rock in the dead middle of your frame, you just use that to autofocus. Then when I recompose, after I take that shot, even if I had my finger held in the shutter the whole time, the next time I take a shot, I'm gonna have to do that all over again. And that involves, releasing my tripod and moving it around and maybe being less accurate. So the thing I love about setting it to manual focus is that it is locked on that rock for every composition that I want to shoot, whether it's portrait, landscape. If I want to put the rock in the bottom left, I can do that, bottom right. So in other words, that lock It's just a little trick I've learned to not have to refocus and recompose each and every time on a tripod, which can get kind of tedious.
Great, thanks for going over that again. So if you are photographing animals that may move or are moving, what do you do in place of a small f number?
What do I do in place of a small f number? Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but so basically, I mean, the small f number is also going to give you speed, meaning shutter speed. It's going to let in more light, therefore you can actually shoot faster. So I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, but if the animal is moving, you can freeze that animal's motion better with a smaller f number. Now, if it's the other way around and you're actually, like I said with that bighorn sheep example, and I'm shooting at f8 or even higher to get the whole sheep horn and eyes and ears in focus, yeah, going from say 4 to f8 cuts the light down significantly. In fact, it actually cuts down into 1/4 the amount of light. So yeah, that's an issue. Like your shutter speed is gonna possibly slow. So for those cases, there's a few considerations. One is oftentimes when I'm seeing bighorn sheep, frankly, they're in relative daylight conditions. So I'm getting enough light from the environment that, you know, at f8 or at f4, the camera is going to give me 1/1200th of a shutter speed. Then f8, it's going to give me 1/300th of a shutter speed, which is probably enough. But more oftentimes, I would say for other wildlife, the thing in my pocket, meaning like the thing I'm ready to do, is just ramp that ISO up. I'm ready to go from ISO 200 to 800 to 1600. This is why I spend a little bit more money on these bigger cameras, is because I can shoot honestly with this camera at ISO 6400 and I barely even see any grain or noise. So I can shoot at very, very high ISOs, which kind of takes that lighting element out of the equation, which is, it's a luxury. It is awesome. So I think that's where you're going with it, but yeah, hopefully that addressed.
Do you often shoot with a polarizer?
Great question. No, to answer that directly, I definitely don't often shoot with a polarizer, and honestly, I rarely shoot with a polarizer. I like them. I understand their use. You know, the main thing that they do is they limit the amount of light to a very specific plane coming through to your lens. And so just like our sunglass lenses, it reduces glare on water. It also has the side benefit of making blue skies richer, and it makes clouds pop a little bit more. I sometimes do when I'm like going hardcore landscape photography, and canyons might be one of those places. But I've noticed that in all the great new Photoshop rollouts, you can do something in Photoshop that basically, it doesn't reduce the glare on surfaces, which is like the one thing you have to have it for, but it's such a small thing. Really what most people are using polarizers for is to make clouds pop and skies look richer and just kind of have that feel to it. And you can go in and you can decrease the blue luminance, meaning darken it in Photoshop or Lightroom, and it basically does the same thing. So, you know, the thing with using a polarizer properly is you really need to take your UV filter off and then put the polarizer on. Otherwise, you get this fringing effect if you start stacking filters. And for me, taking my UV filter off just for a couple shots here and there, I just don't think it's worth it. And you know, it's one step more that I have to do. And then oftentimes, I don't like the fact that it reduces light. So polarizing truly reduces the amount of light coming in through your camera. And so if I'm already kind of, you know, in low light conditions, you know, I told you I can always bump up my ISO, but I still like to keep my ISO low. I mean, I'm not walking out the door with ISO 6400. I'm still trying to shoot at 200, 400, 800 because it is a better photo by comparison. I just don't want anything getting in the way, or I don't want anything getting between my lens and the light like a polarizer would. So I know that there are others out there that will probably disagree, and that's all good with me. I just personally don't use them very often.
Right. Well, unfortunately, Court, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Cool, thanks guys. I really appreciate it. It was fun presenting on this. I always get very nostalgic and excited when I see canyon photos. So it was great putting this one together. thank you so much for my attention or your attention of me today. And it was a pleasure. And we'll see you next time. Maybe see you out in the field.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today, Court. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.